Folks, we're about to start. Just I'll let you do that if you like. I know you're very musical. You can entertain us. Well, Scott, what I know is that you have excellent knowledge of, music, who plays what, recognizing things. I remember you recognizing songs and stuff. So, good stuff. Oh, this is coming across on the transcript. Okay. So now everyone knows that Scott has excellent music knowledge, so we'll start our panel. Welcome everyone to the World Intellectual Property Organization Open Forum. As we have advertised and announced yesterday, our focus in this open forum is going to be accessibility, disabilities, and particularly the WIPO Marrakesh Treaty to benefit persons who are blind, visually impaired, and otherwise print disabled. We'll talk a little bit with our distinguished panelists about the process of adopting that treaty, the process of bringing it into force, and now implementing it. And our panel will last for about 1 hour. We hope to have our presenters give us information for about half that time, and then we are very eager to have a dialogue with the audience, including the remote audience. So we would ask everyone to think about your questions. We will also ask people to keep questions relatively brief so that we have time to accommodate everyone who's interested. So let me briefly introduce our panel, and then I'll describe a little bit about what we've been doing at WIPO with regard to the Marrakesh Treaty, and then we'll hear from our panelists. So directly to my left is Manuel Guerra, the head of copyright for Mexico of the Indotor agency, which is in the Ministry of Culture. And Manuel was actually involved in the entire process and was chairing the WIPO Copyright Committee when we were working on the Marrakesh Treaty. Then next on my left, your right, is Nick Suzor from Queensland Technical University. And he is a specialist, among other things, in accessibility questions, and we'll bring some of that perspective. Trish Hepworth is going to speak on behalf of the International Federation of Library Associations, IFLA, and bring the library perspective to this discussion. Libraries are key entities within the Marrakesh Treaty, both because they were involved in its adoption and because they can act as authorized entities to provide services under the treaty. Finally, we'll conclude with Scott Labar down at the other end of the table. Scott is here representing the World Blind Union. He was one of the key negotiators of the Marrakesh Treaty on behalf of the World Blind Union. He can tell us a little bit about that, but also about where we're going with the Marrakesh Treaty and keeping this realistic, how much work we still have left to do. So, with regard to the World Intellectual Property Organization, many of you probably already know that in 2013, the member states of WIPO adopted the text of a new treaty, which is named the Marrakesh Treaty because the diplomatic conference to adopt it was held in Marrakesh. And the purpose of this treaty is to provide published materials, published copyright works in accessible formats, and to allow that to be done using exceptions and limitations to copyright. Copyright gives exclusive rights to activities including, for example, copying or reproduction to creators or authors or rights holders. And in the case, for example, of books, both the authors and the publishers might have some of those rights. The copyright system also allows for exceptions to these exclusive rights, particularly where there's an important public purpose. In this case, what the treaty does is it adopts an international harmonized standard for having exceptions in copyright laws to allow the creation of accessible formats of published works without having to get permission from the author. So that could be anything from providing a large print version to a Braille version, to an accessible digital version in a number of different formats that have evolved, including, for example, the EPUB standard. The treaty also has what is perhaps an even more unique element, which is it provides for exceptions to allow cross-border transfer of accessible works created under exceptions. Generally speaking, in copyright law, copyright is territorial within a national boundary, and so are limitations and exceptions. If a work is created in one country under an exception, usually it cannot be exported because the exception only applies within national boundaries. What the Marrakesh Treaty does, among other things, is provide for member states to adopt exceptions in their national law, allowing this cross-border transfer of these works without permission, and also putting certain protections into place so that it's clear that the beneficiaries named in the treaty, persons who are blind, visually impaired, and print disabled persons, are those who will receive those works. We at WIPO, after the adoption of the treaty, have been working very hard with partners, including, for example, the World Blind Union and IFLA, to help member states who want to join the treaty. After a treaty text is adopted, member states still have to go through a formal process of joining by ratifying or acceding. And we needed 20 memberships in the treaty for the treaty to come into force and be effective. And so we were very happy this past fall at our WIPO General Assemblies that we were able to announce that the Marrakesh Treaty had received the necessary number of 20 memberships so that the treaty would come into force and be effective with respect to the countries that have joined it. Mexico, of course, is and was one of the early members of the treaty. And so we're continuing that process because the beneficiaries really only get benefits under this treaty in countries that join the treaty. There may be a few small exceptions, but in general, member states need to join for the beneficiaries in their country to receive benefits under the treaty. In addition, we are working on implementation because it's all very well to have a law that says that you can do this, but if there's no technical capacity or ability to create accessible format works or to transfer them across borders, which is generally speaking done in digital format, then the treaty may not bring any real benefits. And what all of us want is to make sure that there are real benefits from the treaty. One way that WIPO is doing this is through our Accessible Books Consortium. Scott is actually on our board. IFLA also has a representative on our board. This is a multi-stakeholder, multi-party, public-private partnership that's working on bringing the Marrakesh Treaty into reality, by implementing it through capacity building activities in particularly developing countries where we work with the blind and visually impaired persons themselves to train them to create the works and to distribute them to other beneficiaries, by working with publishers to try and reach a goal of having books and works actually born accessible, so we don't really need to use the treaty to create the accessible forms. That would be everyone's ideal, is that all works start out accessible. We're a long way from that, but we work with publishers on that goal. And then also do a lot of general public education regarding the treaty, and we have what is called the the ABC Book Service, which exchanges books across borders. Right now, it's largely a catalog of accessible format books that are available from the member libraries. There are about 17 or 18 now, and that will be increasing as more come on board. But we hope that more and more books, some books are already available through that library, that platform, and we're hoping that more and more become available as we no longer have to clear all the rights with publishers, but are able to use the Marrakesh Treaty to have the ability to transfer those accessible books across borders. Finally, I'll just mention briefly that we're looking at accessibility more broadly at WIPO. We are, for example, trying to make sure that our website is fully accessible. There's a lot of work to do to make that happen. We're committed to doing it, but somewhat to our surprise, when we started working with consultants, we found this is going to be a multi-year process. It's one we have underway, and as I said, we're quite committed to that. So that's enough about what we're doing at WIPO. Let's turn to Manuel to hear about what is being done here in Mexico about the Marrakesh Treaty.
Muchas gracias, Michelle. Es un gusto verte en México y a todos mis compañeros dentro de este panel. Quizá complementando un poco más lo que la señora Michelle Woods nos ha expuesto con un gran detalle. Yo quisiera comentarles que el Tratado de Marrakech es el primer tratado internacional humano en materia de derechos de autor. Este es un gran precedente internacional. El Tratado de Marrakech entró a nivel internacional en vigor el 30 de septiembre pasado, al reunirse los 20 países que forman parte inicial de este tratado. México ocupó el 9º lugar. Para México, la inclusión de personas con discapacidad es de gran importancia dentro de la agenda nacional. También quisiera comentarles a todos ustedes que este tratado internacional, en su reforma jurídica, ya forma parte de nuestra legislación vigente dentro de la Ley Federal del Derecho de Autor. México es el primer país que ya tiene la reforma jurídica, la reforma legal, incorporada a su legislación nacional. Esto quiere decir que ya dentro del artículo 148 de la Ley Federal del Derecho de Autor ya se encuentra la excepción en materia de derechos de autor para incluir a los discapacitados visuales y también a todos los discapacitados. Quisiera solo mencionar que Marrakech habla de personas con discapacidad visual. La reforma de la Ley de Derechos de Autor mexicana se encuentra la excepción para cualquier tipo de discapacidades. Este Tratado de Marrakech también genera un gran complemento y también al mismo tiempo es un gran antecedente en el contexto internacional. ¿Por qué? Porque va de la mano con otras convenciones y tratados internacionales de gran importancia. Quisiera señalarles, por ejemplo, la Convención sobre los Derechos de las Personas con Discapacidad. Esta convención de Naciones Unidas, que también fue un gran impulsor, otro mexicano, Gilberto Rincón Gallardo, va de acuerdo con el Tratado de Marrakech, en donde México participó activamente y muy constructivamente dentro de cada paso de las negociaciones también del Tratado de Marrakech. Otro convenio o tratado internacional de gran importancia con el que hace concordancia Marrakech es con el Convenio de Berna para la protección de las obras literarias y artísticas, en el cual fija las normas generales en materia de derechos de autor en todo el mundo. Otro instrumento, que es un instrumento de gran importancia para México, es la Ley General para la Inclusión de Personas con Discapacidad. Esta ley mexicana también forma parte de toda la ayuda a las personas con discapacidad. Otra ley federal mexicana es la Ley para Prevenir y Eliminar la Discriminación, en la cual México tiene una señal importancia, y junto también con el Programa Nacional para Desarrollo y la Inclusión de las Personas con Discapacidad 2014-2018. Para el Gobierno de México es de gran importancia la inclusión de las personas con discapacidad. Ahora, ¿qué es lo importante de Marrakech a favor de las personas con discapacidad. Nuestra Constitución mexicana, que es una constitución muy avanzada en materia de derechos humanos, lo que pretende con el Tratado de Marrakech es darle a las personas con discapacidad el derecho a la educación que está consagrado en nuestra Constitución. También darle a las personas con discapacidad el acceso a la cultura. También darles el acceso al esparcimiento. También darles a las personas con discapacidad el acceso a la información. También darles a las personas con discapacidad la libertad de expresión. También darles la libertad de difusión y también darles oportunidades de acceso al trabajo. Por lo tanto, lo que se pretende dar en México con el Tratado de Marrakech es dar a una persona con discapacidad visual el acceso a la cultura, a la educación, al trabajo, al entretenimiento y, por supuesto, a toda la información. Recordemos que en estimaciones de la Organización Mundial de la Salud, en el mundo existen más de 285 personas con discapacidad visual y que de estas el 90% se encuentran en países en desarrollo, por lo que Marrakech complementa el marco jurídico internacional, consolida el marco jurídico nacional y es un gran precedente a nivel mundial sobre la implementación de tratados internacionales y también, en mi opinión, es un gran ejemplo a seguir. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so Thank you so much, Manuel, and thank you for example, setting the scene a bit more with the extent of the problem worldwide and particularly for developing countries. I'm sure we'll talk more about that. And now we'll turn to Nick. Please go ahead.
Thank you. It gives me great pleasure to be here on this panel with my distinguished panelists. I'm a professor of law, associate professor of law at Queensland University of Technology. I want to talk a little bit about the law, but I really want to focus on the pragmatic questions of where we go next. So first, I really do want to underline the importance of the Marrakesh Treaty, the significance of the Marrakesh Treaty. We've heard a little bit about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is really a landmark shift in the way in which international obligations are imposed on nation states to ensure equal access to information and cultural goods, amongst other things, equal participation in society. This convention is a major change in the way that we need to think about all types of regulation, including intellectual property laws. And for a long time, intellectual property laws have somewhat understated the interests of users, that there are very few required exceptions that protect user rights in international agreements, and it's been left to nation states to best determine how they protect the rights of users under international law, under their own, domestic law. So the Marrakesh Treaty is fundamentally important because it reverses that onus. It creates a positive obligation to create exceptions within the law in order to enable access. And that's amazing. It's a really significant achievement. The question I want to pose today are really, I guess, two questions. We have a massive challenge ahead of us to make the world's cultural and knowledge goods accessible. Part of this requires solving the legal problems, the barriers to access posed by copyright. The Marrakesh Treaty and its implementation around the world is a big step towards doing that. The next part of that problem is, first, to solve the problem of all of the books and other works that exist but are not available in accessible forms, the recorded history and culture of humankind. The second challenge is then ensuring that we can solve this problem into the future. And these are largely problems of coordination, goodwill, cooperation, and funding. Solving the problem for the past requires ongoing massive commitments to digitization, archiving and preservation. Now, there are many digitization efforts that are underway around the world. Particularly national governments have invested quite heavily in digitizing their stores of recorded culture. And maybe Trish will talk a little bit more about the role of libraries in that ongoing challenge. But there's still a lot of work to do to actually make these collections accessible. And largely, I think this is a problem of money. That we can sometimes expect private industry to digitize collections, so things like the Google Books project are a really fantastic way. I think they're up to about 25-30 million books digitized now today. That combined with the efforts of national governments really means that we are making significant inroads on digitizing recorded history and culture. The challenge still remains to make those digital copies accessible, and that is still a costly procedure, to be able to take a scanned book and create an accessible version from that, an open text version first, and then to create different formats of accessible versions from that open electronic text version. That's the big challenge of addressing the past problem, the inaccessible archives of human knowledge. Solving the problem for the future is where we have real opportunities today to think a little bit differently about the process through which we make things accessible. The Accessible Books Consortium is an excellent example of how we try to make sure that we're not going to be in this position in 10 years, that we can ensure that the way in which books are published right from the start take into account the needs of people with disabilities. And that's a really important step that we need to embed into the workflows of publishers, the ability to make sure that the electronic versions of books that are made available in accessible form. One of the specific initiatives that I want to speak about is one that's particularly interesting. Thinking a little bit creatively about how we might ensure greater levels of accessibility in the future. An initiative that's come out of Australia, and I'd be really keen to hear whether other nations have been thinking about this as well, is that perhaps there are ways we can find cheap methods and efficient methods of taking books that are published and ensuring that they are made accessible. One idea is to graft some accessibility procedures onto existing legal deposit schemes. So a legal deposit scheme is a mandatory requirement that any book published in a nation is lodged with a library of record. Recently, many countries have extended this from physically published works to electronically published works, books and other materials as well. And so over the last few years, many books have been flowing into national library archives around the world in electronic formats. Now, unfortunately, in many cases, they're still flowing in electronic formats that are not quite accessible. That much work still needs to be done to take the text and ensure that it's properly formatted for screen readers and other devices, that it's able to be converted to audio versions. Sometimes that requires quite a heavy investment of human labor. We still need, in many cases, humans to read books onto into audio formats in order to create properly engaging works that don't sound too wooden and that are easier to navigate. We need proper bookmarks and other things in the electronic version so that the books are easy to navigate with accessible options. So one of the ideas that we're looking at is developing national cooperation between publishers, between libraries, between groups who are serving the needs of people with disabilities to make use of the books that are coming in through electronic deposit scheme where those books are not otherwise available in mainstream accessible digital formats, to then develop a cooperative scheme to ensure that we can solve this problem, the book famine, into the future. And so these are the types of partnerships, both public and private, that I think must be taken here. To go back to the convention imposes very strict obligations on states to ensure accessibility of knowledge and culture. And in order to actually solve this in a pragmatic way, we need to make sure that we develop the cooperative protocols between publishers and other institutions who are working here to make sure that we have the workflows set out right. And part of that, coming back around, is making sure that we have commercial availability, and then when we don't have commercial availability, working with our public institutions to make sure that they are resourced well enough to create the accessible versions where they're not otherwise available. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Nick, and it's really interesting to hear these ideas about practical ways that we can make sure accessibility is a reality. Now let's turn to Trish to give us the library's perspective, or a little bit of the library's perspective in the time we have available on these questions. Trish?
Excellent. Well, thanks very much. I mean, after that inspiring sort of look into the future about the capacity of libraries, as you can see, with any luck, we are already firmly on a pathway with the resources and the cooperation to a much better situation. The reality of the situation at the moment, of course, is still that less than 10% of published works are available to people with a vision impairment, and there are just as significant problems for people with other disabilities. The library sector has been a very strong supporter of the Marrakesh Treaty. We were heavily involved in its negotiation and its final form, and we're very excited to be involved in its implementation. It's quite interesting. The library associations have really embraced this coming of the internet and its ability to increase the access to knowledge and the access to culture. And a lot of the times when the libraries are engaging in the copyright debate, what we are trying to do is make sure that these opportunities are harvested and we don't accidentally lose the rights that we had in the analog age. But of course, when we're talking about subsets like the groups of disability people, we're talking about access that has never actually been a reality. Clearly, over a long time, a lot of people in the library sector have been working in this area. Our section, the IFLA section of libraries serving people with disabilities, has been incredibly active over a long number of years. But copyright kept coming up as a recurring barrier. And when copyright is seen primarily as a monopoly right protecting rights holders, then there is no incentive, there is no commercial incentive to make these things available. The disability community is disproportionately in poverty. They are a reasonably small section of the market, and so we have never seen a commercial response to making these things accessible. So this was the situation which led to the book famine. Libraries, as I said, are about providing access to knowledge and culture, and the Marrakesh Treaty does exactly the same thing. The libraries are really excited to be working within the Marrakesh Treaty. We are going to be authorised entities. We are already heavily involved in cross-border exchanges. We are involved in the digitisation efforts that will provide the raw materials. We are involved in making the accessible copies. And we are involved in the current situation that we face, which is one, making sure that we actually get all of the countries around the world to sign up and to ratify Marrakesh. And the other one is making sure that we implement Marrakesh in an excellent way. And I'd like to give great credit to Mexico, who has done an excellent job on their Marrakesh implementation. And one thing that we're particularly impressed about is the fact that it does extend to disabilities that aren't specifically covered by the Marrakesh Treaty. IFLA was saddened that the circumstances around the creation of Marrakesh excluded a lot of people with disabilities. the needs of somebody with a hearing impairment to subtitles are just as real as the needs of a person with a sight impairment to large print or braille or DAISY format. So we would encourage that wider range of disabilities to be included with any domestic ratification and implementation process. A couple of other key points that we would like to see in domestic implementation. We would like to make sure that countries don't include the time-wasting obligation to conduct searches for commercial availability. Realistically, it's never going to be 100% sure that you can exclude commercial availability, and the realistic situation is if there's a commercially available book available, it is cheaper to buy that book than do the conversion yourself. We don't think that we should have supplementary remuneration for rights holders. We are generally talking about public interest institutions that are working on incredibly tight budgets, that don't have enough money to do the things that they need to do at the moment. So we think that those funds would be much better spent creating new accessible works. We don't think there should be onerous record-keeping obligations. There is no evidence of piracy on any serious scale that comes from the accessible transcriptions. And libraries in particular have a long-standing code of conduct and a history of sticking to codes of conduct and doing things all above board and of respecting copyright. We also think that we need to not put too many onerous, restrictive registration requirements on authorised entities. The way that Marrakesh works with its cross-border transactions is that it's authorised entity to authorised entity. So we need there to be as many authorised entities, respectable authorised entities, but we need these authorised entities to be available in as many places and in as many languages and in as many formats as possible. Marrakesh is a very good treaty, and it points the way to an approach of copyright that better reflects the balance between the right to intellectual property, the rights to access, and the rights of people with disabilities to access knowledge and culture. The library sector is incredibly glad to contribute to making this a reality and to extend the principles behind this treaty to all people who would be otherwise excluded from the knowledge economy.
Thank you so much, Trish, and now let's turn to Scott.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And I want to thank my fellow panelists who have covered the waterfront pretty well. It was my intention to speak less, so I wouldn't have to say much. However, I am a lawyer, and regardless, I probably will say more than I should. The problem is knowing where to start. This treaty for those of us in the World Blind Union has always been much more than a copyright treaty. And it's that way because what this treaty does is sends a very strong global message that access to information for those who are blind, visually impaired, or otherwise print disabled is a global priority. This is critical not because it's something nice that the world could do. It is critical because of the lives people like me live. And I want to, I guess, underscore this point. It is a fact that in the United States, even though we have access to more accessible information than anywhere else, we only can access something less than 10% of published works. Why is that a big deal? Some people have basically said to me, well, so you don't get all the books you want. But it's much broader than that, because what it means is it's a lack of access to knowledge. And a lack of access to knowledge means a lack of access to education, and a lack of access to education translates into a lack of access to employment. And without employment, you cannot achieve any level of prosperity. Even though I live in the richest country in the world in terms of accessing information in an accessible form, more than 70% of persons who are blind, 70, are unemployed. You may have heard that last week, unemployment in the United States reached a low of 4.6%, which means, of course, that over 95% of those who want to work are working. Can you imagine over 70% of the blind who want to work can't? And why is that? It's directly linked to the lack of information. And that is why the work we do through Marrakesh is critical. Now, that's the best case scenario in the world. Let's talk about the rest of the world. In the 285 million people who are blind or visually impaired, as Manuel said, 90% live in developing countries. In those countries, over 90% of those blind or otherwise print-disabled children can't even go to school. So if you can't even go to school because of the lack of access to information, you have no hope or prayer of ever getting employed. So what this means is a highly disproportionate number of those of us who are blind and print-disabled in the world are living in poverty. This is a global crisis. That's why we called it the book famine. So when we work on these problems, I think it is critical to remember that we're talking much more about a human rights crisis than an intellectual copyright scheme. I want to congratulate all of the stakeholders who have worked very hard in the Marrakesh process to come to consensus and get a treaty that is already changing lives. But as Nick said, so much more needs to be done in order to make Marrakesh's promise of access to information a reality. The Accessible Books Consortium, which Michelle and others have spoken about, is one good step in that direction. And I can go into great detail about the programs of ABC. ABC is just a little over 2 years old, but already over 100,000 people in the world have benefited from books that have come out of that process. Now that Marrakesh is in force, we hope to see that number increase rapidly. It is critical that we think about accessibility on the broader scale. The more we can make information accessible in the beginning of the process, the better chance that information will get into the hands of people who are blind or otherwise print disabled. That's why one of the goals, one of the major objectives of the Accessible Books Consortium is to work on inclusive publishing, having these books born accessible. And critical to all of this, and this is how I guess I'll wrap up this portion, is, of course, the internet. The internet provides the structure, the infrastructure through which we can make the exchange of accessible books a reality. But let's also keep in mind that it is critical that we build accessibility into the internet. Yes, it is great that I can use software to get on the internet, do my email, do some word processing, but a lot of the information that is out there in a digital form is inaccessible because people have not thought about making it accessible. And this is critical because the internet is based on computer code. Computer code is not inherently visual in any way. It's just ones and zeros. bits and bytes. It's all about coding. It's all about making the software compatible with the assistive technology that the blind and others use. And there are standards for this, and I can go into detail about that. But we need to make a priority of using those standards. Let me just give you a real small example. I wanted very much yesterday to work on the plane using the internet. I went through the process of signing up until I got to the end of that process where I had to purchase the plan, and there was one little box that was not accessible to me. And because of that one little box where I had to put in some numbers, I couldn't buy the plan. So, many times, even though we have the promise of accessibility, we are still shut out. So those are the things I would say to begin with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott, and thank you for bringing us back to the internet. Of course, we are here at the Internet Governance Forum, so it's great to bring that perspective to this panel. Now we'd like to open up to, as I said, brief questions. We think there probably will be quite a few questions, and we'd like to make sure we accommodate everyone as much as possible in the time we have left. And first, I'm just going to look and see whether we have any questions waiting from our remote participants. Okay, not at the moment. Great. Well, we're glad to have people with us remotely. So I do see a number of hands raised, and we have helpers who are kindly going to give microphones. So over here on the right, I think we have two questions. Let's take both of them and then turn to the panelists to give some answers. If you could please state your name and your affiliation briefly, and then give your question. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm David. I am a librarian, and I want to ask for the panelists how we can improve the libraries to be entities, authorized entities, because in the domestic implementation we have great issues. We need education for librarians to know how to do it. And also we need it, but with a perspective from accessibility and access to knowledge. Not just see the copyright as protection, but the other side. And please, I want to ask you, especially to Ms. Michelle Woods, give us a hand to a treaty for exceptions and limitations for libraries, not just in the digital, but also in the analog world. Thank you very much.
Great, and if we could pass the microphone up to the other questioner. Thank you.
Buenos días, gracias al panel y al auditorio. Esto va para el señor Guerra, con todo respeto. Hablaba de muchos calificativos de inclusión. La inclusión como tal, creo desde mi perspectiva, son dos vertientes. Una es, te incluyo en o para, pero ¿qué te doy adentro para que te desenvuelvas una vez que estás incluido? Esto es, hoy las escuelas públicas, particularmente en México, tienen la obligatoriedad de inscribir a las personas con capacidad diferente, no importa el tipo de capacidad diferente, no discapacidad, capacidad diferente, ¿sí? Y los meten a un lugar donde no se entienden prácticamente con nadie, pero ya están incluidos. Bravo, están incluidos. Por ahí, en un foro en la Universidad de Guadalajara, me permití hablar o dirigirme al rector, al señor Tonatiu, donde le hice el mismo comentario. ¿Y dónde está la sensibilidad de los demás actores? Una, para entender, sí, a lo mejor ya ni para comprender, para entender que hay personas que van a actuar de manera diferente porque tienen la falta de un sentido, ¿sí? Cómo hay que comprenderlos, cómo hay que involucrarlos. Y más allá de eso, cómo va a capacitar a su personal laboral, administrativo, ¿sí? Para que puedan interactuar con estas personas que tienen una capacidad diferente. Me dijo que lo iba a tomar en cuenta. Afortunadamente, desde hace unos 2 o 3 años, en algunas preparatorias ya se está capacitando a maestros mismos de la universidad para el lenguaje de señas. Quiero hablar particularmente para las personas sordas, ¿sí? El lenguaje de señas, se les iba a pagar más sueldo a las personas que se capacitaran, ¿sí? Entonces, ser parte del gobierno es algo muy interesante, es algo que nos da el poder hacer algo o mucho por la gente. Y quiero aprovechar nada más este escenario para pedirle que si en sus manos está, ¿sí? No nada más hagan una ley y que digan a todas las personas con capacidades diferentes se les debe dar la oportunidad de asistir. No. Todas las personas con capacidades diferentes, ¿sí? Pueden incluirse porque va a haber las herramientas necesarias y los actores suficientes para que se integren, no nada más se incluyan. Es nada más eso y les quiero agradecer mucho su atención y su tiempo. Gracias.
Thank you so much. So let's turn to the panel members to respond, and then we'll come over to some questions over here on the other side. So we had 2 questions, one that was more focused on libraries, one more focused on the situation in education, specifically here in Mexico, but of course those concerns are much more universal. Would Trish, you like to say something about the libraries point?
Yeah, so thanks very much for both questions. I think absolutely, when you're looking at access, there are really 2 big ones. One is having the stuff available to be accessed, and the other is having the method to be able to access these things. So we could produce 2 million accessible books in Spanish, for example, but if it turns out that half or 3/4 of the blind population in Spanish-speaking countries don't have access to the internet, then there's not much point. So this is one of the areas that IFLA has been really heavily involved in, and we're really happy over the world to be involved in projects like the Global Connect to be able to bring internet access and, more important, digital literacy and digital skills to these people so that we can fulfill both sides of this accessibility problem. But as David says, there is a huge resource problem still, and we need to be doing more to make sure that not just librarians, but as our second speaker was talking about, teachers and professors and all of the other people have these skills, not just to be able to do their side of digital literacy, but to be able to be proactive champions for making this accessible, to be able to communicate with people, to be proactive in making sure these programs are available. I think that's probably the most important bit from us.
So Scott, it looks like you're about to add to that, is that?
Sure. Couple of things. In terms of getting access to the information, even if you create the accessible information, it is critical that you have the tools to access that information that are also accessible. Your website, whatever software or platform you're using. The classic example is perhaps having some electronic books that are accessible in and of themselves, but on an inaccessible platform, like a certain kind of e-reader. That was a problem we had in the United States, where perhaps the book might be an accessible digital book, but it was being offered to patrons on an inaccessible Nook or some other device. The other thing, though, in terms of being an authorized entity, there are resources out there. The Accessible Books Consortium can talk to you about what some of the standards are and where you can get information. One of the partners and one of the members on the board of the Accessible Books Consortium is the DAISY form, which has a lot of information about how to create accessible books and to operate as an authorized entity. The other authorized entities that are part of ABC, of course, can offer resources about how they do their job. And then finally, the WBU, the World Blind Union, will be coming out soon with a guide on the implementation of Marrakesh, which in part talks about the activities of authorized entities. And there will be other sources as well. WIPO continues to work on this, and I know that the publishers are as well.
So, Manuel, would you like to respond to the second question?
Muchas gracias, Michelle. Es una excelente propuesta la que acabo de escuchar. Quisiera pues, partir de un principio. Tenemos una ley, ya hay una ley. Yo creo que es algo que tenemos que ver en forma positiva. Ya hay un gran ejemplo de tratado internacional, que es el Tratado de Marrakech. Yo creo que es un gran principio para abatir un gran problema y también un gran reto. Para mí incluir no solamente es poner, sino yo lo que he estado en mente cuando estábamos haciendo las negociaciones del Tratado de Marrakech es dar una igualdad de oportunidad a las personas con discapacidad. Que las personas con discapacidad tengan las mismas oportunidades que yo tengo para acceder a un texto impreso o para acceder a un medio digital, en el caso que nos ocupa. Pero en general, que tengamos las mismas oportunidades. Eso es lo importante que tenemos que crear todos. Pero esto se lleva a cabo fundamentalmente con una sensibilidad humana. Eso es lo más importante que debemos de tener cuando veamos a una persona con discapacidad. Es lo que tenemos nosotros que sentir como seres humanos, que hay una persona con discapacidad que debe tener las mismas oportunidades que yo tengo, aunque yo no tenga discapacidad. Por eso es un problema de sensibilidad fundamentalmente. Ahí es donde las leyes, las constituciones y los tratados internacionales realmente surten efectos. Y hablo y reitero el término personas con discapacidad porque es el término que en el lenguaje internacional se utiliza para las personas con discapacidad, porque primero son personas y después tienen una discapacidad. Ese es el lenguaje internacional que por lo menos legalmente usan los tratados. Y también créanme que haré todo lo que esté de mi parte como funcionario, pero principalmente como ser humano, para poder ayudar a darles las mismas oportunidades a las personas con discapacidad que a cualquier otra persona. Lo haré como funcionario y lo haré siempre como ser humano y transmitiré esa sensibilidad a todos los que me rodean. Eso ténganlo por seguro.
Thank you so much, Manuel. We had two questions over here on the left, on my left, the lady in the red blouse and then the gentleman in the second row on this side. So if we can take those two and then have the panelists comment again.
Thank you. My name is Helen Ladrón de Guevara, University of Guadalajara and IFLA. I'm thinking ahead, and I don't know if you can answer this because maybe it's not the purpose of this meeting, but as a librarian, I'm thinking what can this forum can do to put some pressure in the job market. Because one thing is to give accessibility to all this information through the different equipment, you know, and for people with some kind of disability. But what happens when they go out to the job market? Not all business are sensitive, and I agree with Manuel Guerra. They are lacking the human sensibility. They're not giving the equal opportunities to people that have, you know, they're blind, they don't hear well. These businesses don't have the equipment. I had the opportunity to work for Chicago Public Library, and I think Mexico has the legislation that says that certain percentage of the workers, can be working in any kind of business, but they don't have the equipment. They are lacking the sensitivity to incorporate these people with this kind of disabilities. What kind of pressure we can do, as the Internet Governance Forum, or with which agency to make these businesses respond in a more humane way?
I'm Bobby Beatty. I'm a filmmaker and I design experiences for all senses. So I have a question of Scott and perhaps to anybody else on the panel. I mean, today there are technologies like Siri and Alexa and other voice recognition technologies. So is there an effort to sort of combine this side of technology, the internet and the vast availability of content that there is, to create sort of specific opportunities or products for the visually impaired? Because it seems to be a very natural thing to do.
Michelle, you want me to?
Sure, go ahead.
I guess I'd like to respond to both questions. First, with respect to the employment issue, I'm glad you brought that up, and you're right, it isn't directly related to what we have been talking about here. However, it is a result of the lack of information. And what I think a forum like this could do is perhaps two things. One, call upon all the companies and entities that are involved, all the libraries, all the private entities, and all the governments to actively adopt a diversity plan that includes people with disabilities and targets goals of hiring them and make an active effort to recruit them. And that can be done in many different ways through private and public partnerships. And then also, what we have learned in the United States is the actual average cost of accommodating a worker with a disability is pretty low. And it is rather easy for employers to take on that cost. And it's much better for society, because if you get people with disabilities working, they are then contributing members to the society. They are no longer on government benefits or welfare programs. They start contributing to the tax base. So in terms of public policy, it's absolutely the right thing to do. And we could spend all day talking about that first topic. As to the second topic, yes, there are many different efforts going on in terms of creating accessible technology, and there's two levels of that. One is creating the kind of technology that takes mainstream technology and turns it into something accessible. I have something on my computer called JAWS for Windows, which is a screen reader which takes the text embedded in the computer code and turns it into speech. That's one. And there's all kinds of work being done in that area. The other level, of course, is building the technology, the accessible technology, right into the mainstream products. The classic example is the iPhone and iDevices. They all have something called VoiceOver. And I'm not talking about Siri here, I'm talking about VoiceOver, which is a part of the phone or other iDevice you can enable that allows you to have text to speech. It will tell you what's on the screen. It will tell you what to do to select a certain item. And of course, once you build that kind of technology into your products, it just becomes very easy to continue that kind of technology. So again, this topic is another one that we could talk about all day.
Absolutely. Do any of the other panelists, Nick, you want to have a brief comment?
I just want to make a brief comment on that, on the aspect of technology here. And I think that there are two things that we really need. And the first is, at the design stage, people need to start ensuring that they are thinking about accessibility from the very start. And we need to do more to work with technologists to make sure that we have this embedded into the design. Second, there are real political issues around the use of these accessible features. Scott mentioned the iPhone and the iOS devices. Another example might be Amazon's Kindle, which was originally accessible with a text voiceover function. Amazon, to its shame, enabled publishers to disable that functionality for the fear that it would interfere with the audiobook market. Publishers, to their shame, have gone ahead and largely disabled accessible features on their devices. And this is not a question of design, but a question of political will, and we really need to be vigilant about this.
Great, thank you. And on that, oh, Trish, very quickly, we are going to have to wrap up. But
sorry.
go ahead.
Just wanted to mention, we also need to think when you're talking accessibility of sort of those interlinkages. So it's one thing to make things accessible for people who are literate, but you've got an entire another lot of problems when you're talking about people who potentially are not literate or speak a language that is not widely spoken. So we've got a lot of intersectionality that really complicates a lot of these things, and there is not going to be one simple, easy technological solution, as disappointing as that is.
Thank you, Trish, and that's a very good, sobering, but absolutely correct note on which we can end this panel. We're sorry we don't have room for more questions, but of course the panelists would be very happy to continue some of this discussion out in the hallway, and we thank everyone very much for their participation, both our panelists and the audience members who've been engaged and who obviously care very deeply about this very important topic. So thank you very much, everyone.